I'm going to show you how to use the sleep schema element. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing. We're going to see how to use the sleep schema element in a few moments, but just before we do, make sure you take a look up there in the corner where you'll find a playlist for all the videos in this series. In the previous video, we saw how to use JavaScript code. Specifically, we saw how to use the system.sleep method to cause our workflow to sleep for a specified number of milliseconds. But there's an easier way to do it. What we're going to be seeing here in a few moments is the sleep schema element, which again is much easier to use. So let's head to the lab environment. To save us a tiny bit of time, I've already created this workflow. As you can see, I have a workflow here called Sleep Schema Element. If we open it up, let's see what's in there. So when we open up this workflow and go to its schema, as you can see, there is, besides the start and end schema element, there's a single schema element called the Sleep Schema Element. Now, if you go looking for the schema element called Sleep, you're not going to find it here in the generic section. If you want to call the sleep schema element, that's hiding down here in the basic section. So there it is. All right, so to cause this workflow or any workflow to sleep using the sleep schema element, I'm just going to drag the sleep schema element into my schema, which I've already done here. So let's click on the schema element. And as you can see, if we go look at its inputs, it has a single input called sleep time. And well, we'll see how to set up the sleep time in a moment, but sleep time, as you might imagine, specifies how long, in seconds, we want the workflow to sleep. That's a little different from the previous video. When you call system.sleep, you have to tell us the amount of time in milliseconds. Here, you just simply tell us how many seconds, and we'll do the math for you. So again, there's this variable called sleep time that gets used in this JavaScript code that shows up here in the scripting tab. And this JavaScript code, as the first comment, the comment on the first line points out, this JavaScript code is automatically generated. You don't have to write this at all. And all this workflow is going to do is use that sleep time variable that we're just about to set up to indicate how long we want to actually sleep. So as you can see here on line number 3, this is the line that actually causes the sleep to occur. So again, the only thing that we have to set up to make this work in the sleep schema element is this one variable called sleep time. Now, when you first come in here, sleep time, it'll say sleep time here because that's the name of the variable within the sleep schema element, but you have to connect that. You have to bind that to a variable or an input within your workflow. So before I got this far, I could have gone to the variables tab to create a variable or to the inputs tab to create an input. And whether I used an input or a variable, that would be used to store how much time I want the sleep to take. Now, over here, we simply do the binding. So to connect the sleep schema elements variable called sleep time to my variable or my input parameter, I'm simply going to go to this drop-down list, and it will give me a choice of variables in my workflow or inputs my workflow that are numbers. It has to be a number, or it'll let me create a new variable on the fly. And this works just like all sorts of other workflows that we've seen previously. So again, I can either create a new variable or a new input here by choosing create new, or I could go to the variables tab, input, or the inputs tab in advance, and then to create the variable, and then simply select the variable here. But either way, you have to have a variable or an input that specifies the amount of time you want the workflow to sleep, and you have to set up the binding, an inward binding to that variable or that input right here in the input-output section. And that's all there is to it. Let's run the workflow and see it in action. So to do so, I'll go to Run. And as you can see in this particular case, the workflow is prompting us to specify how long we want the workflow to sleep. And that's simply because we created an input. On the other hand, if we created a variable, we could have hard-coded the value or set it programmatically as the Orchestrator workflow developer. But here, it's an input, so we're going to prompt the user, how long do we want the workflow to sleep? So we'll specify some amount of time, such as 15 seconds. We'll click Run. And as you can see initially, it says here that the schema element's only been running for a single millisecond, but that number is going to jump up in the, shortly. But just before it does, take a look up here. Notice that it says that the workflow is running. We'll say something about that in a moment, but the workflow is just about to be done here. There we go. As you can see, the workflow is completed. But in that time frame, when it said that the workflow was running, what was actually going on behind the scenes is that Orchestrator, the Orchestrator server, had saved the state of the workflow itself and thereby was able to pause the workflow. The workflow was not actually consuming any CPU cycles while it was in that sleep state, but once the sleep period of time elapsed, the Orchestrator server automatically loads the workflow back in and the workflow starts running again. Join me in the next video where I'll show you how to use the waiting timer schema element.